The trail had not been on the map. It appeared as a thin break between the trees, barely visible, like a scar that the forest was trying to hide. I followed it anyway, stepping over roots and damp leaves, telling myself that paths existed for a reason, even when no one remembered why. The light was already changing, not disappearing, not yet, just thinning, stretching into long gray bands between the trunks. The kind of light that makes distance unreliable, the kind that turns familiar shapes into questions. I noticed the first sign without understanding it. The birds stopped calling. At first it felt like coincidence. Forests have moods, sound rises and falls. But this wasn't a gradual quiet. It was abrupt, as if someone had closed a door. 1 second there were scattered calls, wings shifting, life moving above me. And the next, nothing. I kept walking. The ground sloped gently upward and the air grew cooler, sharper. My breath came out slower, more visible. With each step, the feeling returned. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. The sense of being placed inside something larger, something that had edges I couldn't see. That was when I felt it behind me. Not a sound, not a movement, just pressure. The certainty that space itself had changed. I stopped. The forest did not respond. No snapping branch, no rustle of leaves. Nothing that would confirm or deny what my body already knew. The silence pressed closer, thick enough that I could hear my own pulse, steady but loud, echoing in my ears. I stood there longer than made sense. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time felt unreliable too. When I finally took a step forward, it felt like permission had been granted, not by me, but by whatever was allowing me to move at all. The trail narrowed, trees crowded closer, their trunks darker here, bark rough and uneven. I brushed one with my hand and felt moisture cling to my fingers. Moss, cold, alive. Something scratched the ground ahead. I froze again. This time the sound was real. It was light, brief, controlled. Not the careless noise of something passing through, not panic, not hunger, awareness. I waited. Nothing followed. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Small animals, falling debris, wind shifting through the canopy. But the air was still. The leaves above barely moved, and the sound had come from ground level. Low, deliberate. I continued, slower now. The forest floor changed under my boots. The soil grew softer, darker, disturbed in places. I noticed impressions that didn't match my own steps. Wide spacing, deep marks where weight had settled, then lifted cleanly away. I crouched, examining one. The edges were sharp, fresh. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees, the shadows between them, the spaces where light refused to reach. Nothing moved, nothing revealed itself. But the feeling intensified, no longer behind me alone. Now everywhere, above, beside, ahead. I realized then that I had not heard my own footsteps for several minutes. The forest was absorbing them. The trail ended without warning, not at a clearing, not at an opening. It simply dissolved into undergrowth, swallowed by ferns and low branches that curved inward, blocking the way. I stopped at the edge of it, confused, trying to remember how long I had been walking. That was when I felt the gaze. It was different from before, closer, direct. My shoulders tightened on instinct, muscles pulling inward as if preparing for impact. Every part of me screamed not to turn around, not because something would be there, but because it already was. I forced myself to breathe, slow, controlled. The forest remained silent, but the silence had texture now, depth, weight. It felt layered, like something crouched within it, patient and unmoving. A branch snapped to my left. I spun. Nothing, just trees, shadows, the illusion of safety. Then another sound, tall behind me this time, not a snap, not movement, breath low, measured, not mine. I took a step backward and felt the ground slope away unexpectedly. I stumbled, arms flailing, boots sliding on damp earth. I caught myself against a tree, heart hammering hard enough to blur my vision. The breath stopped. I stood there, pressed against the bark, listening so hard it hurt. My ears rang. My chest ached from holding air I hadn't realized I was refusing to release. When the forest finally exhaled again, it wasn't relief I felt. It was warning. Because whatever had been close enough for me to hear its breath had moved. And it had done so without making a single sound. I didn't run. Running felt wrong, loud, desperate. Instead, I turned slowly, scanning the spaces between trees. The dark hollows beneath branches, the elevated rocks where shadows pooled unnaturally. I searched for shape, for outline, for anything that would give the fear a form. There was nothing, and that was the worst part. The realization came quietly, settling into me like cold water. This wasn't a chase. It was an assessment. I was being measured, observed, followed, not as prey yet, but as possibility. I took one careful step forward. Somewhere in the forest, something matched it. Perfectly. I stayed where I was longer than was reasonable, back pressed against the tree, fingers digging into the bark as if it could anchor me to something solid. The forest did not relax. It did not resume its normal rhythm. It simply waited. I began to understand then that movement alone was no longer neutral. Every step carried meaning now. Every sound, every pause, every change in direction was being noted. I pushed away from the tree and started walking again, carefully placing each foot. I avoided loose branches, stepped over leaves instead of through them. My breathing slowed, not because I was calm, but because instinct demanded silence. The ground leveled out and the trees thinned slightly, creating longer sight lines between trunks. That should have helped. Instead, it made the absence worse. There were too many places to look, too many shadows that could hide depth. I felt exposed, as if the forest had opened just enough to make sure I knew it. That was when I noticed the pattern. Whenever I stopped, the pressure returned. Whenever I moved, it followed. Not immediately, not clumsily. Always delayed by a breath, a heartbeat, just enough to remain uncertain. If I took 3 steps, it responded with 3. If I paused, it paused too. The timing was too precise to dismiss. I tested it. I veered suddenly to the right, stepping off what remained of the trail, pushing through a cluster of low branches. The movement was sharp, noisy. Leaves tore, twigs snapped. I waited. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then behind me a sound answered, softer than my own disturbance, but identical in rhythm. Branches parted. Leaves shifted. Something moved where I had moved. My stomach tightened. I didn't turn around. I kept going, changing direction again, looping left this time, forcing my way through denser growth. My pulse hammered in my ears, but the forest remained eerily controlled. The responding movement came again, closer now. The delay had shortened. The distance was closing. The realization was immediate and cold. Whatever was following me was not confused, it was adjusting. I broke into a jog. The sound behind me did not increase, it simply stayed with me. That was worse than pursuit, worse than noise. The absence of urgency meant confidence, effortless tracking, energy conserved. My breath grew louder despite my attempts to control it. My lungs burned as the ground began to slope downward, roots slick with moisture. I nearly slipped twice, catching myself at the last second, heart spiking each time. Still no sound of effort behind me. The trees grew taller here, their branches forming a canopy so dense that light filtered through in narrow, shifting beams. Shadows pooled at their bases, deep and unmoving. I passed a fallen log and noticed something carved into the damp soil beside it. Long, narrow, parallel. Marks where something had stopped, pivoted, pushed off again. I slowed, dread curling tightly in my chest. The forest ahead opened into a shallow ravine. A dry creek bed cut through it, rocks smoothed by water long gone. I descended carefully, boots scraping stone despite my best efforts. The sound echoed too much in the confined space. Halfway down, the feeling intensified sharply, like standing too close to a live wire. I knew without seeing it that the distance between us had closed significantly. At the bottom of the ravine, I stopped. The silence here was complete. No wind, no insects, no distant calls. Even my breath sounded wrong, too loud, too foreign. I crouched, forcing myself to stay low, scanning the opposite slope. The far side rose steeply, scattered with boulders and exposed roots. It was climbable but slow. Exposed, every movement would be visible. A pebble shifted behind me, just one. It rolled gently, clicking once against stone before coming to rest. I did not turn. I didn't need to. The sound was close enough that I could place it exactly in space, a few steps back, slightly elevated. Close enough that if I moved too suddenly, the gap would disappear entirely. The air changed. There was a faint smell now, musky, sharp, alive. Not decay, not rot. Something clean and wild and unmistakably present. I became aware of my own posture then. How rigid I was, how my shoulders had lifted unconsciously, making my silhouette taller. I forced them down, making myself smaller, slower. Another sound came, this one unmistakable. A soft exhale, controlled, quiet, intentional. The breath of something that did not need oxygen urgently. I turned my head just enough to look over my shoulder without fully committing to the movement. I saw nothing. No shape, no eyes, no outline. Just a darker density of shadow between two rocks that had not been there before. And then, barely perceptible, it shifted. Not forward, not backward, sideways, circling. My throat tightened. Swallowing felt impossible. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to explode into motion, to break the tension before it snapped on its own terms. But something deeper, older, held me still. I understood then that speed alone would not save me, that this was not a test of endurance but of decision, of awareness, of whether I would continue to behave like something lost or something worth correcting. The shadow moved again, faster this time. I stood, slowly, deliberately. My legs trembled, but they held. I raised my hands slightly, not in surrender, but to widen my outline, to appear larger without being aggressive. I turned fully now, facing the space where the shadow had been. Nothing. The ravine was empty, but the feeling did not leave. Instead, it sharpened. The pressure shifted from behind to directly in front of me, as if whatever had been there had simply stepped out of sight. Not gone, just repositioned beyond my ability to track. A sound came from the slope ahead, not a footstep, not movement. A low, brief vibration that traveled through the ground more than the air. a warning. I realized then that I was no longer being followed from behind. I was being guided. The warning did not repeat. That was the most disturbing part. Whatever had produced it had achieved its goal with a single signal. It didn't need to escalate. It didn't need to rush. The forest itself seemed to accept the new order immediately, as if a line had been drawn and acknowledged by everything living within it. I took a step forward. The pressure eased. I stopped. It returned. Not behind me, not beside me, ahead. The message was unmistakable now. Movement was permitted, but only in one direction. I climbed out of the ravine slowly, deliberately choosing each foothold. Rocks shifted under my weight, but no answering sound came. The absence felt intentional, as though noise itself had been withdrawn as a courtesy or a test. At the top, the forest changed again. The trees stood farther apart here, their trunks thick and straight, bark scarred with old marks. The ground was clearer, fewer shrubs, fewer places to hide at eye level. Visibility extended perhaps 30 meters in every direction. I should have felt relief. Instead, the tension tightened further. Open ground removed uncertainty, but it also removed excuses. There was nowhere for anything to accidentally remain unseen. If something chose not to be visible here, it was because it did not want to be. I walked. The trail was gone now, replaced by a subtle depression in the soil, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I realized with a chill that it wasn't a trail at all. It was a route, used repeatedly precisely by something that moved with purpose and memory. The feeling of being observed intensified, but it no longer came from a single point. It was everywhere at once, like pressure equalizing across the space. I passed a cluster of trees and felt it immediately, a shift in proximity, too close. I stopped without thinking. The forest responded instantly. A shape detached itself from the background. Not fully, not dramatically. Just enough. It stood between two trees ahead of me, its form partially obscured by shadow, its outline blending seamlessly with the vertical lines of the trunks. At first glance, it could have been nothing more than an irregular shadow, a trick of light and bark. Then it moved its head. The motion was smooth, economical, controlled to the smallest degree necessary. No wasted energy, no hesitation, eyes locked onto mine. They were pale, not reflective, not glowing, aware. The moment stretched, elastic and fragile. The animal did not crouch. It did not bare its teeth. It did not growl or snarl or threaten. Its posture was neutral, almost relaxed, weight evenly distributed, muscles engaged but not tense. It wasn't preparing to attack, it was assessing. I felt something collapse inside my chest, not fear alone, but understanding. This was not curiosity, this was judgment. The wolf stepped forward once, silently. Its paws made no sound against the soil, its shoulders rolling fluidly beneath thick fur. The distance between us shortened by a single meter. That was enough. I felt exposed in a way I had never experienced before, like every intention, every weakness, every wrong calculation had become visible. My breathing betrayed me immediately, hitching despite my efforts to control it. The wolf stopped again. It tilted its head slightly, studying the change. I forced myself to steady my breath, to slow it, to reduce the frantic signals my body was broadcasting. I remembered fragments of advice, half-forgotten warnings. Don't run, don't stare too aggressively, don't turn your back. None of it felt sufficient because this was not a defensive encounter. This was territorial. The wolf took another step, then another. Each movement was deliberate, measured, designed not to provoke panic but to compress space, to remove options, to narrow the world until only one outcome felt possible. I realized then that it was not alone. I didn't see the others. I didn't need to. The awareness arrived all at once, fully formed, subtle shifts at the edges of vision, the sense of depth changing. The forest no longer feeling empty but layered. The pressure wasn't singular anymore. It was distributed, encirclement without visibility. My mouth went dry, swallowing burned. I shifted my weight unconsciously, a minor adjustment meant to stay balanced. Immediately, a sound answered from my left. Soft, brief, unmistakably intentional. A confirmation. I froze. The wolf in front of me did not react. It didn't need to. It already knew where everything was. Time lost meaning. Seconds stretched thin, then snapped back into place without warning. My thoughts fragmented, cycling through impossible calculations. Distance, speed, direction, none of them added up to survival. And still the wolf did not attack. Instead, it lowered its head slightly. Not submissive, focused. The message was clear now, written into posture and stillness rather than sound. You are standing where you should not be. You have been allowed to understand that fact. What happens next depends on how well you learn. I took one step backward. The response was immediate. A low sound rippled through the space around me. Not loud, not aggressive, but resonant, vibrating through chest and bone more than air. It came from multiple directions at once, overlapping just enough to erase any doubt. This was the boundary. I stepped forward again, returning to the exact position I had occupied before. The sound stopped. The pressure eased slightly. The wolf lifted its head and held my gaze. I understood then that escape was not about speed or strength or cleverness. It was about compliance, about reading the invisible rules being enforced without mercy or malice. Slowly, carefully, I turned my body to align with the direction the wolf had first allowed me to move. I did not take my eyes off it, but I softened my focus, letting my gaze rest without challenge. The wolf watched. I took a step. Nothing happened. Another step. Still nothing. I was being permitted to leave, not chased away. Released. The forest seemed to exhale as I moved, tension unwinding incrementally with each meter of distance. The encircling awareness receded, not gone, but loosening, like a net being drawn back in. I did not look back. I did not run. I walked until my legs burned and my lungs ached and the trees began to change again, thinning into unfamiliar patterns. Only when the pressure fully disappeared did I allow myself to stop. Even then, I knew something had changed permanently, because I had not simply survived an encounter. I had been measured and found wanting, but not worth correcting. The forest never announced when it released me. There was no clear boundary, no dramatic shift in light or sound that marked the moment I was no longer being followed. The change revealed itself only through absence. The pressure that had pressed against my chest for what felt like hours simply wasn't there anymore. I walked another 100 meters before I trusted it, then another 100. Only when my legs began to shake from delayed adrenaline did I stop and lean my hands against a tree. My palms came away damp, streaked with dirt and sap. My breathing was loud now, uncontrolled, embarrassingly human. Each inhale scraped my throat raw, as if my body had waited for permission to collapse. I listened. The forest had returned. Birds called again, uncautiously at first, single notes testing the air, then fuller songs overlapping each other. Leaves rustled in the canopy. Somewhere far off, branches cracked under the weight of something moving without urgency. Life resumed as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. That terrified me more than the encounter itself, because it meant what I experienced had not been chaos. It had been order. I checked my watch. More time had passed than I expected. The sky had shifted, the light angling lower, shadows lengthening between the trees. I forced myself to keep moving, following my compass, this time without deviation. I did not allow curiosity or false confidence to pull me off course again. Yet no matter how far I went, the memory stayed close. Not the image of the wolf, the feeling, the clarity of that moment when I understood I was not the most important presence in that space. Not the smartest, not the most dangerous. Just another living thing that had crossed into a system far older and more efficient than my own. As I walked, I noticed details I would have ignored before. Scratches on bark at shoulder height. Paths through undergrowth that curved subtly instead of cutting straight lines. Clearings that felt wrong, too intentional in their emptiness. The forest was full of signals, boundaries written into soil and silence rather than signs. I had simply never learned to read them. Dusk settled quickly. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the sky had turned a muted gray-blue, the first stars beginning to appear. The transition was abrupt. One step I was surrounded by trees, the next I was standing in open ground, the forest walling itself off behind me like a closed door. I stopped and turned. The trees stood motionless, dark and uniform. No shapes detached from their shadows, no eyes watched from the edge. And yet, I knew. I knew that if I had turned back earlier, if I had panicked, if I had run, if I had tried to assert myself, I would not be standing there. Not because the wolves were cruel, because they were precise. I reached my vehicle just as night fully claimed the land. My hand shook as I unlocked the door, the metallic click sounding absurdly loud in the open air. When I finally sat inside and closed the door, the enclosed space felt foreign, fragile. Glass and metal suddenly seemed like thin promises against a world that did not need to announce its power. I drove away without turning on the radio. Silence felt appropriate. For days afterward, sleep came in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that pressure again. Not fear, but awareness. The sensation of being evaluated without emotion. Dreams replayed the moment endlessly, always changing small details, always ending before resolution. But something else followed me too. Respect, not admiration, not comfort. Respect born from understanding limits. Weeks later, I returned to the area, not to the ravine, not to the deeper forest, but to the edge. I stood where the trees began and stopped myself there. I did not cross the line again. I didn't need to, because the lesson had already been delivered with absolute clarity. The wolf had not attacked. That was the warning. It had shown me that violence was optional, that control did not require chaos and dominance did not require blood. The forest had allowed me to leave not because I was strong, but because I had learned quickly enough. Some nights when the wind moves just right and the air grows unnaturally still, I remember the soundless steps, the pale eyes, the space closing without a single threat spoken aloud. And I understand something most people never do. The most dangerous moments are not when an animal charges, they are when it watches, when it follows, when it decides you are not prey, but not welcome either. Because in those moments you are not facing instinct. You are facing judgment, and the forest is very patient.